Is it water with the sheep in the box?
Alright, let's talk about prisons. This appears to be a big deal in online discourse of late, as prisons seem to have overtaken sports as the primary arena in which the trans panic can be perpetuated, because obviously putting a trans woman in a woman's prison is just inevitably going to lead to widespread rape and abuse, right? Well, yes, but in the opposite direction, but more on that later on in the video. And prison rape and abuse is bad regardless of who it happens to, right? Right? Obviously, the prison reform and or abolition movement is a big deal, and is mostly supported by the far left as opposed to just about everyone else, but it's good to know that in our fight to improve the conditions of our prison system, we at least have allies in the gender-critical movement in trying to fight for the rights of those behind bars. After all, abuse and exploitation is rife within the prison system. Often marginalised people are disproportionately affected by a biased and harmful justice system, and the for-profit system incentivises overcrowding and reduction of quality of life in the pursuit of profits. All of these things are incredibly important issues we as empathetic people with an interest in fairness and safeguarding of vulnerable prisoners need to contend with, and obviously people who are so vocal about the rights of women in prison not to be at risk of being near an LGBT person have long histories of passionate advocacy for prison reform, I'm sure. But how many people does this actually affect? Well, according to government statistics, there are a total of 230 trans prisoners in the prison system. 187 of these prisoners reported their legal gender as male, 43 as female, 11 prisoners were known to have a gender recognition certificate as of 2022. A total of 6 transgender women are currently housed in women's prisons. You heard me right there, 6 people. All of this bullshit and panic and stuff is concerning 6 people out of the 84,000 people currently being held in prisons across the UK. So it's basically a non-issue then, isn't it? But okay, even so, maybe there's still something to get mad about. How is this decided upon? I bet they just put anyone who says they're a woman into a woman's prison. Well, it's pretty straightforward, really. On a case-by-case basis, each case is assessed by the local transgender case board, depending on the nature of the individual case. If a decision cannot be reached at this stage, the case may then be referred to the complex case board, who will do a more thorough assessment of the best decision for both the individual person and the other prisoners. Generally though, people are housed in the prison that corresponds with their legal gender, so that depends on whether or not you have a GRC, but obviously, as the numbers imply, this is by no means a guarantee, and more often than not, one of the case boards will decide to house transgender prisoners in the prison corresponding to their birth sex. They can dispute this, and we can argue about whether or not it's right or moral, and personally I think it's a little too harsh, and the appeals process isn't robust enough, but regardless, you can't really argue that any sex criminal who says that a woman gets put in prison with other women, putting them at risk, unless you're either being deliberately dishonest or just ignorant of the facts, which hopefully you are no longer. But we're already here, so whilst I have your attention, let's briefly go over some actual prison issues and ask ourselves whether the transphobes actually care about them, rather than just using them in order to attack trans people. Shall we? Prison overcrowding is one of the key contributing factors to poor prison conditions around the world. It is also arguably the biggest single problem facing prison systems, and its consequences can at worst be life-threatening and at best prevent prisons from fulfilling their proper function. The proper function of a prison and what it should be is another point of debate, and we'll get into that later. Prisons in over 118 countries exceeded their maximum occupancy rate, with 11 national prison systems at more than double their capacity. My local prison, for example, is literally 300% over capacity, as confirmed by a local criminology professor. Overcrowding is a consequence of criminal justice status policy. It's that profit motive again. Try to force in as many prisoners to the existing framework rather than build more to make more money by stretching resources beyond their intended purpose and save on infrastructure costs. It's not due to rising crime rates, as some may argue, though there is an incentive to increase conviction rates in order to increase the overall amount of prisoners to exploit economically, and the prison lobby is actually quite significant. Overcrowding undermines the ability of prison systems to meet basic human needs, that of healthcare, food and accommodation. And, as mentioned, the existing provisions are being stretched beyond their effective limits. It also compromises the provision and effectiveness of rehabilitation programs, educational and vocational training, and recreational activities. The excessive use of pretrial detention and the use of prison for minor, petty offences are critical drivers of prison population rates. As it turns out, incentivizing profit and punishment over rehabilitation and humane treatment is bad. So, let's say you're claiming to care about prisoner welfare and want to protect prisoners from having to deal with trans people existing in the same space as them. This seems like the sort of thing you should care about, eh? And yet, where are the mainstream TERF and gender-critical people pushing for a reduction in prison overcrowding? I can't seem to find any. But alright, let's talk a bit more about those conditions. Our prisons are absolutely fucked. Like most public services under the Conservative government, this is mostly due to cuts in public spending and privatisation, along with something we'll talk about later that is unique to prisons, the idea of punishment, and that people being kept in inhumane conditions is good actually because they're bad people, and the law and justice system is perfect and never makes a mistake or unjustly imprisons someone. And this is important to discuss because prisoners are living in squalid and inhumane conditions in buildings that are unfit for purpose, an assertion backed up by a recent report that paints a damning picture of UK prisons, and if you pretend to give a shit about the well-being of imprisoned people, well, you should care about this. Let's look at the report, shall we? As one source pointed out, prison ethics boards across the UK have raised a number of failings that directly affected health and safety, including overflowing toilets and urinals, damp, mould and unheated cells, and a sewage pipe uncapped for months. 4 prison boards described conditions as squalid, others as inhumane and unfit for purpose. In one facility, prisoners were forced to use buckets to flush their toilets because they were blocked, and there seemed to be no rush to fix the issue as there was waste and excrement on the floor and overflowing urinals, reportedly for weeks. At another, the Health and Safety Executive is investigating the origin of a Legionella outbreak that left 1 prisoner dead. Half the prisoners at Long Lartin and 400 prisoners at Coldingley, those are 2 British prisons, were in cells without any integral sanitation. The boards at those prisons described the situation as inhumane and undignified. Dame Anne Hours, chair of the Independent Monitoring Boards, or IMBs, said, "There is no question that we are still reporting some serious and ongoing problems in prisons. The decline in safety, conditions and purposeful activity in prisons over the last few years has seriously hampered their ability to rehabilitate prisoners." Boards across England and Wales continue to raise the issue of 2 prisoners sharing a cell meant for one, with a toilet, sometimes unscreened, in a cramped space where they also ate their meals, which the report noted would not be acceptable in any other publicly owned building. The report pointed out failures in maintenance contracts which exacerbated the problems caused by underinvestment over many years. One prison had 900 outstanding essential maintenance jobs, another more than 1,300 planned, and a further 1,300 preventative jobs. The mother and baby unit at Eastwood Park, one of only 3 in the country, was out of use for more than 2 years because of catastrophic water damage. The report also highlighted the issue of insufficient and inexperienced staff, the impact of rampant drug use on prison safety, the overuse of segregation for prisoners with serious mental health concerns, and shortcomings of community rehabilitation companies, as well as housing and benefits problems that undermines successful resettlement. Francis Cook, chief executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform, said, "As the eyes and ears of the local community, people who volunteer to be independent monitors play a vital role in trying to keep prisons safe. The reports revealed the enormity of the challenge to transform a failing prison system that has been asked to do too much with too little for too long. Peter Dawson, director of the Prison Reform Trust, said, "This report makes for very sobering reading for the prisons minister. There can be no disputing the first-hand, directly observed evidence of over 51,000 individual visits to prisons. The report describes a catalogue of failure to deliver even the most basic standards of care and a chronic waste of human and physical resources in our prison system." So, let's say that you're claiming to care about prisoner welfare and want to protect prisoners from having to deal with trans people existing. This seems like the sort of thing you should care about, eh? After all, female prisoners are also having to deal with this, and as mentioned, one of the issues here pertains to mother and child wings, and transphobes seem to be obsessed with the purity and power of motherhood, and yet where are the mainstream TERF and gender critical people pushing for better prison conditions? I can't seem to find any. People in prison are also more likely to have suicidal thoughts. While data on suicidal thoughts is not systematically collected in prisons or the general population, in 2018 there were 92 self-inflicted deaths in prisons in England and Wales. People in prison are at increased risk of suicide than the general population. This is true internationally for both men and women. Let's just go through some statistics, shall we? According to the latest figures published by the Office for National Statistics, male prisoners are 3.7 times more likely to take their own lives compared to men in the community. As women account for just under 5% of the overall prison population, it is difficult to estimate the risk of suicide in women's prisons reliably. However, there is evidence to suggest that women in prison in England are up to 20 times more likely to take their own lives than women in the community. This risk remains high even after release from prison. In England and Wales, men have been shown to be 8 times and women 36 times more likely to die by suicide than others in the community in the first year after release from prison. The gap between rates of suicide in prisons and the general population is widening. Through much of the 2000s, the rates of self-inflicted deaths in prison fell, partially closing the gap between rates in prison and the general population. However, since 2012, the rate of self-inflicted deaths in prison has increased significantly. It's concerning that the gap between prison and the general population suicide rates appears to have worsened over the past decade, which just so happens to coincide with the Conservative government's austerity policies. Suicide risk is not static over the time a person spends in prison. Suicide risk in England and Wales is significantly higher during two major periods of adjustment. Early days in prison. In 2018, almost a quarter, 23%, of all self-inflicted deaths occurred in the first 30 days in prison. The highest suicide rates in prisons in England and Wales were found in male local establishments, prisons which receive prisoners directly from courts and house them during the early days in prison. Alcohol and drug dependence play a particularly large role in suicides that occur within the first 7 days of entering prison, which can be a difficult period of withdrawal. Transfers to a new prison. 30% of self-inflicted deaths in 2018 occurred within 30 days of the transfer to a different prison. Adjusting to prison life is especially difficult for those who have never been in prison before. A third of prisoners in England and Wales who took their lives between 2007 to 2013 were in prison for the first time. Being in prison for the first time is strongly associated with increased risk of suicide thoughts, with risk often being higher during their first few days or weeks in a new prison. Uncertainty is related to increased suicide risk and is especially relevant to two groups of prisoners: those on remand, prisoners pending trial and sentencing, and those serving indeterminate sentences. Prisoners on remand frequently report feelings of uncertainty. This group have the highest rate of self-inflicted deaths of all sentence type at 3 per 1,000 prisoners. Almost 1 in 5, 18%, of prisoners who took their own lives between 2007 and 2013 were serving an indeterminate sentence. Feelings of hopelessness and entrapment associated with suicidal thoughts are common among people serving indeterminate sentences, especially following an unfavourable sentence review. The nature of the prison regime has a significant impact on suicide risk in prisons. Lacking control over simple activities or a lack of purposeful activity has been associated with suicidal thoughts in prisoners both in England and Wales and internationally. Prisoner-staff relationships and a consistent regime are especially important in managing suicide risk in prisoners and can act as key protective factors. Isolation has been found to directly contribute to increased suicide risk in prisons. This is the case for both being locked up in a cell for extended periods of time as well as feeling socially isolated from other people. However, evidence suggests that supportive social community in prison can protect against suicide, for example by encouraging access to trained buddies and facilitating family contact. Seeing or hearing about a suicide in the prison can significantly increase prisoners' suicide risk. This phenomenon, known as contagion, has been observed in approximately 6% of suicides in prison and 15% of self-harm incidents in prison. Closed environments such as prisons are particularly prone to contagion, partly due to the greater chance of prisoners identifying with the deceased. This phenomenon is not unique to the prison environment and is also observed in the general population in different settings, often related to the effect of media reporting of suicide. So, let's say that you're claiming to care about prisoner welfare and want to protect prisoners from having to deal with trans people existing. This seems like the sort of thing you should care about, eh? And yet, where are the mainstream TERF and gender-critical people pushing for better mental health support and suicide prevention methods in prisons? I can't seem to find any. Not that I'm surprised, they constantly dismiss or cruelly mock the rate at which trans people commit suicide, but you'd have thought that they would at least care about cis prisoners' mental health and well-being, but I guess not. Prison rape is an incredibly common media trope, and sadly is also a very common real-life phenomenon. If you've ever watched basically any kind of media, you will be aware of this. The rape of men is often seen as a kind of joke, and to be honest, a lot of people view the prospect of prisoners being raped in prison as a bonus and a sort of additional punishment and deterrent against doing crimes or some shit. As a result, often the systemic rape culture inside especially male prisons is not really acknowledged or acted upon, as it's just what they deserve or something. Also, legally, it wasn't so long ago that male-on-male rape was even considered such, being considered non-consensual buggery until 1994. Most of the victims are either those considered more feminine or easily dominated, or in some cases it's a punishment rape perpetrated against a particularly hated prisoner, usually a sexual predator or someone who harms children. I just want to make this incredibly clear because when transphobes say that they want trans women to be put in a male prison, they are at the very least saying that they actively want them to be at risk of sexual victimization of assault, the very thing that they're claiming they care so much about when it happens to cis people. They feign concern for cis women and the apparent risk trans women pose to them when it comes to sexual assault, but when faced with the fact that their positions actively increase sexual assaults, they tend to avoid discussing it because the fact is that they don't actually care about sexual assaults, they just want to use an emotionally evocative topic to victimize a group of people they hate. Some statistics for you before we begin, for context. There were a reported 24,661 allegations of sexual victimization by inmates in 2015, an amount nearly triple that of 2011. Of the 24,661 allegations, 1,473 were considered substantiated. Of these substantiated incidents, 58% were perpetrated by inmates and 42% by staff. Between 2012 and 2015, there were a total of 67,169 allegations. Investigations for 61,322 of these allegations were conducted, 5,187 of which were substantiated. Between 2011 and 2015, allegations in prisons increased 180% from 6,660 to 18,666, and in jails it went up 184% from 2,047 to 5,809. Officials reported less than 8,800 incidents of sexual victimization in American prisons and jails in 2011. However, between 3% and 9% of male prisoners say they were sexually victimized, indicating that more than 180,000 current prisoners are likely to have been victimized, but that these incidents have mostly gone unreported. Inmates of private prisons are half as likely to say they've been sexually victimized by other prisoners as those who are in public prisons. However, they are about twice as likely to report sexual victimization by staff. 66% of incidents of sexual misconduct by prison staff involve sexual relationships with inmates who, quote, appeared to be willing, unquote, according to authorities. Women consist of 7% of the total population, 22% of all victims of inmate-on-inmate sexual victimization, and 33% of all victims of staff-on-inmate sexual victimization. The amount of inmate-on-inmate assaults was 38% higher in private prisons than public ones. Now, If any TERFs, gender-critical people or transphobes are watching, I must ask you for a moment to take a step back and attempt to feel empathy for trans people. Imagine, if you will, that trans people are human beings worthy of decency and respect. Why is it acceptable to you that they get raped? Because make no mistake, they absolutely are. Once they're incarcerated, trans people are at significantly higher risk of violence, both physical and sexual. Trans prisoners are over 9 times more likely than the average to be assaulted or abused by fellow prisoners, over 5 times more likely to be assaulted or abused by facility staff, according to a 2015 study conducted by the National Centre for Transgender Equality, which states that within the year leading up to the survey, almost a quarter of transgender prisoners reported being physically or sexually assaulted by other people in custody or staff. One prisoner quoted describes being raped in custody by a man who held a razor blade against her neck. On other occasions, she said she was beaten by other prisoners, including one time being beaten by a 4x4 piece of wood. Formerly incarcerated trans women say that abuse often comes at the hands of correctional officers. They have this whole language they use towards the trans community, one remembers. They call us horrible names. They used to have us strip out in front of other inmates to embarrass us. They used to come and ransack our cells and take our makeup. They wouldn't let us eat in chow halls if we were wearing any makeup at all. In short, people arguing for putting trans people into the prison associated with their birth sex will argue that men could falsely claim to be transgender so they're housed with women so they can then assault them, but as it turns out, there is no evidence to support that this happens on anything approaching a statistically significant way, while on the other hand, there is overwhelming evidence that trans women in men's prisons are being sexually assaulted and otherwise abused at exponentially higher rates than the general incarcerated population, which is already incredibly high. Additionally, prison rape is such a huge problem and requires serious action to curb and try and stop. But again, nobody seems to give a shit about a prisoner's safety and the high rates of assault within prisons at any other time, only when they can pretend to care in order to use it as a stick with which to beat LGBTQ+ people. Because make no mistake, the overwhelming majority of abuse is being perpetrated by cis people. Why does the risk of a trans person being sexually violent, which is significantly lower than the average anyway, require them to be put in a different prison, but violence carried out by, say, a cis woman against another cis woman doesn't invite the same response? People say it's because they're sexually deviant or because they're likely to attack or prey on the women in there, but surely the same is true of cis women too. Plenty of cis women sexually assault other cis women. Should those people, who are overwhelmingly gay women by the way, because for obvious reasons rapists usually target people who align with their sexual orientation, be housed in a male prison as well? After all, they mostly pose a threat to other women, not men, right? And then we get back to the logical conclusion of this whole argument. Should gay men be put in women's prisons and vice versa for lesbians? And of course, should the same rule apply to, for example, shelters, bathrooms, etc.? Should lesbians be excluded from female spaces because there's a vanishingly small chance that they might pose a threat to other women, even though statistically they're more likely to be the victims of homophobic attacks by straight women in these spaces than perpetrate any kind of attack themselves? Because that's basically what's being proposed here. But because trans people are seen as an acceptable target, people who would be totally against any kind of similar attack on any other minority group are actually in support of segregation when it affects them. This is the same bollocks as when all the Conservatives pretended to give a shit about women's sports, back when that was the popular angle from which to attack trans people. Come on now, you really think people like Piers Morgan or Graham Linehan actually care passionately about women's sports? Of course they don't. Likewise, they don't actually advocate for prison rights or justice reform in any context that doesn't involve weird culture war bullshit, enabling them to harm or attack LGBT people, which tells you all you need to know right there. So, let's say that you're claiming to care about prisoner welfare and want to protect prisoners from having to deal with trans people existing. This is the literal thing you pretend to care about, sexual abuse in prisons, and yet where are the mainstream TERF and gender critical people talking about this when trans people are not involved? Again, I can't seem to find any. The effective response to crime has always been a matter of debate. While the retributive idea of justice seeks to inflict a cost or hardship on the criminal as a just response to crime or to deter or punish the criminal, the rehabilitation model seeks to provide support that can reform the criminal and prevent future reoffending. At the end of the day, it comes down to philosophical goals and the view of criminals. Are criminals inherently bad people who need to be controlled and punished by force, or are criminals ultimately a product of society and the environment they found themselves in? The answer to this question will more often than not dictate your preferred approach to prison reform. In the UK, for example, there is wide public support for tough criminal justice sanctions, and tough on crime rhetoric is at this point a very predictable, though effective, method of drumming up more conservative support when polls aren't looking too good. For recent example, look at the recent genuinely horrifying stuff the government has been saying about refugees. But there is just as much support for rehabilitation, and when presented with evidence around the cost of prison, roughly £40,000 per prison place per year, a majority support looking into cheaper alternatives to prison, meaning that there is public support for alternatives to custody that can rehabilitate criminals. The problem is that it's less viscerally satisfying. People want to see the bad people get their comeuppance, and putting criminals into therapy fulfills less of that urge for revenge. The big question, though, is this. What works? Well, obviously, again, that depends on your definition of working this time. If you think the point is to punish prisoners, then obviously inhumane conditions, abuse, etc. effectively achieves this goal, for example. But let's be honest, when people talk about proof of effectiveness of a justice system, they mostly mean two things: crime rates and, crucially, recidivism or reoffending rates. So, let's take a look at that, shall we? An international comparison reveals some interesting trends. Norway moved its focus from punishment to rehabilitation over 20 years ago, pissing off conservatives a hell of a lot because at a distance it seems that the prisons are cushy and the sentences short. However, it is difficult to argue with results, and this approach was followed by large reductions in reoffending rates. Compared to a reoffending rate around 50% within a year in the UK and almost 80% in the US, Norway's is around 20 to 25% in 5 years. So what can we learn from this? Well, obviously, it shows that rehabilitation is a better method than retribution, and highlights that a lot of people processed within the criminal justice system have vulnerabilities that can make them prone to reoffending, hence why rehabilitation and therapy can be so successful. Shockingly, recent evidence suggests that the UK prison population has serious levels of self-harm, and a recent report found that 90% of the UK's prison population suffer from mental health problems, exacerbated by, well, being in prison, as we just covered. Rather predictably, releasing such people without investing in their treatment and at least helping them overcome or mitigate their struggles is bound to lead to reoffending. No shit, right? If you lock someone up in a cage in a few years every time they commit a crime without bothering to address the reason why they keep committing crimes, that's just going to commit a cycle of crime, capture and release. Locking up or otherwise criminalizing people with these vulnerabilities also raises ethical issues. In particular, what would be a just response to a crime committed by the vulnerable? This obviously then leads to discussion of scale and class. Like, if you, as a working class person, steal £200 worth of goods from a shop, you can get up to 7 years in prison, but if you steal billions through financial trickery or corruption, you get at most a slap on the wrist. Likewise, if you kill someone directly, you obviously go to prison for a long time, but if you deliberately cause mass death either through corporate abuse in the third world or government policy, again, slap on the wrist if anything at all. As they say, a single death is a tragedy, but 1,000 is a statistic. From an economic perspective, rehabilitation makes sense. A recent study provides illustrative examples of changes in sending more people to prison versus community sentences. Based on a statistical model using data in case disposals and crime rates across England and Wales, it provides estimates of how changes in case disposals affect crime rates. For example, sentencing 1% more offenders to prison for property offences, including theft and handling, would be estimated to reduce the following year's recorded crimes by 2,693, but a similar 1% increase in community sentences reduces those offences by 3,590. When one considers that community sentences cost an average of a quarter of prison sentences, it appears that there is scope to reduce property crime, approximately 72% of recorded crimes in the analysis, more cost effectively and humanely through a greater use of community sentences instead of prison. Views on crime and punishment differ, yet almost everyone would agree that we care about crime because of the harm caused by it. One does not have to have any particular ideological bent to advocate an approach that reduces harm. There is evidence that rehabilitation, including within prison, reduces crime and can be cost effective. Economic analysis also, therefore, reinforces the idea that punishment is not the best solution for reducing the harmful impact of crime. Likewise, it has been shown time and again that poverty is the most accurate predictor of crime, so if we really want to reduce crime, we must first tackle the actual root of it, which it appears is poverty. Oh, and one final thing before we move on. When we talk about criminals, we tend to think of like proper wrong-uns, violent, sexual assault, murder, that kind of thing. But being honest here, we all must know, whether we want to accept it or not, that in among these more serious criminals, the ones in for decades to life, are people in there for petty crimes, minor crimes, drug offences and so on, and will be out in months or at most a couple of years. Do those people deserve the same level of treatment as serial killers or child rapers? Likewise, it's very rare to have an actual life sentence handed down nowadays. In the UK, that's a whole life order and is reserved for the most dreadful extreme offenders, and is a very small proportion of the overall prison population. What this means at the end of the day is that, like it or not, most criminals will eventually re-enter society. Do we want to mould them into someone who can reintegrate before that happens, or are we going to try and fuck them up as much as possible in the name of punishment? So, let's say you're claiming to care about prisoner welfare and want to protect prisoners from having to deal with trans people existing. This debate seems like the sort of thing you should care about, eh? And yet, where are the mainstream turf and gender critical people debating this? I can't seem to find any. This is one of the most important points, in my opinion. Almost everything else we've discussed so far could be effectively mediated, if not outright resolved, if doing so was the actual goal and the will to do so was there. The resources are certainly there. This is an industry raking in cash hand over fist after all, but this is and always has been the problem with privatisation. In the short term, it brings in cash to the government, and if you really believe strongly in the inherent supremacy of the market, I guess there's a few ideological reasons for that too, but realistically, the end result of almost all privatisation is lower standards and higher prices passed on to the end user. We can see this in the UK when it comes to the rail and power systems, which are both significantly worse and also not exactly affordable for a majority of people in comparison to our European neighbours, who wisely didn't privatise all their public services in the 80s, and even to the way these services were prior to privatisation. The reason, of course, is the incentive. A corporation is incentivised to make money by any means necessary. In fact, that's the only purpose of a corporation, and the two main ways of doing that are reducing costs, thus making the services worse, and raising prices, thus making the services less affordable. But because these services are necessary, nobody's getting by without electricity, and in places like London, public transport is basically the only safe, efficient way to get anywhere, and of course many people don't drive at all, so they still have to pay. The same is true of prisons, since being at least partially privatised, it's become clear that law enforcement and elected officials sometimes deploy programs and practices that generate money for their agencies by criminalising mostly low-income people and marginalised communities. Many probably also don't know that in the US, prisoners are compelled to work, often for less than $1 an hour. So obviously, it follows that private prisons incentivise people who are easily corruptible to advocate for increasing the prison population to make profits and increase prison slave populations. In recent years, criminal justice reform advocates and even certain judges have described law enforcement and judicial policies in some cities and municipalities as modern-day debtors' prisons or judicially sanctioned extortion rackets. A lesser known phenomenon is that of the lucrative trade in prisoners between states in the US, swapping prisoners or paying private companies to hold them across state lines, or, thanks to the 13th Amendment, literally slave trading, but legal. Also, largely unreported, is the fact that local governments can effectively serve as headhunters in the marketplace for incarcerated people. They can facilitate deals to have private companies build jails for the federal government, even in a different jurisdiction, and get a cut from the company. The financial incentives and legal mechanisms that enable mass incarceration, revenue streams, federal policy mandates, administrative and municipal actions often go unnoticed or unmentioned, as is the crucial role that police, sheriffs, county commissioners and corrections department bureaucrats play in this whole fucked up system of commodified human misery the world over. Laying bare the operations also exposes the roles that some officials play in advancing mass incarceration. In practice, it's largely prison bureaucrats that decide carceral policy rather than judges, legislatures or political communities. Police and commissioners play a primary role in proposing, securing funding, and deciding the scope of jail construction, and they're often eager to expand jails. And that's without getting into stuff like lobbying, which is a huge problem. I have yet to see the gender criticals get on a soapbox about for-profit prisons though. Standing for anti-abortion and anti-contraception causes, sure, but nothing to do with this. Which is weird, because they are claiming to care about prisoner welfare and want to protect prisoners from having to deal with trans people existing. This whole system of prisons for profit seems like the sort of thing they should care about, and yet where are the mainstream TERF and gender critical people pushing for renationalisation? I can't seem to find any. Alright, so what was the point of all this? Well, in brief, to ask the following question, where are the TERFs advocating for prison reform? Prison is often abusive, unsafe, ineffective, and inhumane for inmates, male and female, trans and cis. So where are the gender critical people advocating for prison reform that might help alleviate this situation and improve the conditions the inmates they claim to care so much about suffer under? Well, of course, the simple answer is that they just don't really care at all, just like they weaponize women's sports to attack trans people, despite not really being concerned about the issues female athletes face, and often just calling female athletes who are unusually tall for a woman men on Twitter. It's not a sincere principle they hold, it's a position they can hide behind in order to harm trans people, a weapon they can insincerely wield in order to bludgeon vulnerable LGBT people and remove their rights and legal protections. We can demonstrate this by simply asking the following question. If it's about trans prisoners being in some way predisposed to or else at a higher risk of perpetrating violence towards other female inmates, despite the inverse being true, as trans prisoners are demonstrably significantly more likely to be victims of violence than the perpetrators of it, why is it that that concern is not extended to, for example, violent cis female prisoners? After all, women do commit violent, heinous crimes too. Some of the most infamous murderers in British history have been women, and of course, women are perfectly capable of physically or sexually abusing or victimizing other women. So, if you get put in prison for, I don't know, tax fraud or selling weed or protesting the government or some shit, you're likely to be abused by both fellow inmates and the prison guards. Is the gender identity of your cellmate really going to bother you at that point? If you're going to be attacked, the attack is the problem, not the gender of the person doing it. But alright, maybe you're just worried about trans women perving on fellow prisoners in the showers or some shit. Well, what about cis lesbians? This is the exact same issue as the single-sex spaces shit that gender-critical people like to bang on about when it comes to changing rooms, for example, and suffers from the same issues. Namely, if you're worried about a trans woman who is attracted to women going into a space where people they are attracted to might be for sexual reasons, well then surely, by that same logic, all lesbians should be excluded from female spaces, in case one of them is a bit of a creep. Should gay women be forced into the men's and gay men into the women's? What about bi people? Where do we go? Further, we must ask why trans women existing in a female prison is always bad and predatory, but male prison officers, from whom a lot of the abuse comes, and of course unlike trans prisoners who are in the same boat as everyone else, hold a position of power and authority, is not. Or if it is, why is it given significantly less attention in the press and by the transphobic apparent prison welfare advocates? I think we know the answer. These people don't really give a shit about the welfare of female prison inmates, just like they don't really care about women's sports. It's just a convenient stick with which to harm trans people and fearmonger over the scary LGBTQ+ people, or whatever. Don't believe this bullshit.